every morning with drive. Being on the grind, know I had to survive. We had to win. Started from the dirt and the rubble. I had to be the needle that was popping your bubble.
Hello and welcome into the Rookie Prospect Profile Series. This is a Zilla Fantasy Elite production. Today, very excited to be looking at running back Deuce Vaughn. Deuce Vaughn was drafted number 215 overall by the Dallas Cowboys. They come into the league out of K-State or Kansas State. Looking at some of their physical traits, very, very interesting here. He comes in at 5'5", 179 pounds. That's a BMI of 27.2. Came in with a 40 time of 4.61, which is pretty sluggish for a running back, especially considering his weight, giving us a speed score overall of 79.3, which is probably one of the worst in the database. Putting these physical traits along with some of their college numbers into the RStudio model, and this is very, very important to remember. This is RStudio model versus a machine learning model, and this is going to be a good lesson learned for everybody in this particular episode. So putting all these numbers into the RStudio model with their college numbers, we get a prospect score in the RStudio model of 9.867, which ranks 275th overall out of the 310 running backs in the RStudio model's database. That is the 11th percentile. So shifting over to see who are those closest comparables to Deuce Vaughn's prospect score, we see that the next closest better than him are Kenneth Farrow, Raheem Mostert, Justin Forsett, Tarin Poole, and Mike Boone. And then the five closest below are Craig Reynolds, Rod Smith, Matt Breida, Josh Harris, and Alfonso Smith. Again, not an inspiring list here. You know, Raheem Mostert has had some solid weeks and seasons, I guess, as a professional here later in his career. Mike Boone never really panned out. Justin Forsett had a solid season in there. Matt Breida, always kind of on the cusp of being super viable, but not terribly great. That's what the RStudio model is saying. Hey, Deuce Vaughn, probably not a very good prospect. Look the other way. That was my thought process going into this, is Deuce Vaughn and Devon Achane a little bit too small for my liking. And I don't think they're going to be super good in the NFL, but a little bit of a lesson learned here. So let's switch then to the machine learning model to get that juxtaposition between what Deuce Vaughn was doing in the RStudio versus what he's doing in the machine learning model. So we look at the machine learning model for Deuce Vaughn. We can see that he comes in with a mean of 13.50, median of 13.40, a minimum value of 8.62, and their maximum prediction all the way up at 17.87. That 10th percentile outcome, 10.62, 25th percentile outcome, 12.02, then the 75th and 90th at 14.93 and 16.60 respectively. Then their mid-50 gap is at 2.91. Just to get into some of these numbers and what kind of people you can be looking at. That 13.5 range for Deuce Vaughn, that's like Duke Johnson, Chris Ivory's best season in the league, Joique Bell, Amir Abdullah, Ronnie Brown, Ronald Jones, they're at 13.3, going a little bit higher than that, 13.51. Kenneth Walker last year, just above him. Clyde Edwards-Helaire in his rookie season. Darrell Henderson, 13.6 in his best year. So right around there is kind of what they're saying an average outcome for Deuce Vaughn should he get 80 opportunities in a season. Going into the max prediction all the way up at 17.87. Really good for a guy his size. I was shocked to see the outcome here. James Robinson, 17.89 is just above that max amount. So, pretty good season there from him. Najee Harris, 17.69. David Montgomery, 17.65. Mark Ingram, 17.4. Nick Chubb's best season, 17.31. Getting a little bit higher than that. Joe Mixon, 17.99. Leonard Fournette, 18.25. Peyton Hillis, 18.43. So, some pretty good players there up on the max range. And really where we can see this discrepancy between the RStudio model and then the Deuce Vaughn model is really when we look at their ranks. So switching over to the ranks here, we can see Deuce Vaughn, mean rank number 5, median number 5, minimum is the 4th best, maximum the 7th best. And then getting into those 10th, 25th, 75th, and 90th percentile outcome ranges, 6th, 4th, 5th, and 4th respectively. Then we see that M50 gap there ranked 29, going back to the numbers here, that M50 gap of 2.91. We see that's one of the worst ones in here, combined with some of the best actual output. So how can this be? Deuce Vaughn, super tiny, 179 pounds, 5'5". How is it coming up with this for an outcome? Well, here's where the lesson comes in. My original model, I had 1,688 total neural connections to train and validate the set on. I worked pretty hard in determining what worked best and produced the closest predictions to reality on those 20% validation players. And with that in mind, everything seemed to be as accurate as I could get it. We went into the draft. Everything was hunky-dory. A-Chain came out really well in the model, which I was a little surprised about, but, he's fast. And kept going. Everything looked like it was nice and lockstep where you would think. Deuce Vaughn goes through the model after he gets drafted. He was the number 1 prospect in the neural network at that point. And I was like, what the heck? How did I put something in wrong? I reran it with making sure all of my data was correct for the Deuce Vaughn information. Sure enough, I put it in there. It's saying, his maximum output would be like 34 points. It's saying his average output should be like 22, 23. I'm like, how is this coming out that he is that good? And then it kind of dawned on me, A-Chain was super good in this too, and they're both really small, so that kind of triggered something. I adjusted Deuce Vaughn's numbers, so I made him 5 foot, keeping the BMI the same as like 5 foot and 150 pounds or something like that, whatever it was, and changed his speed score, left everything else the same, but just made him smaller and changed the associated numbers. Pretty much everything else the exact same, except for the size. And I ran it again. And this time, Deuce Vaughn came out even better, and I was like, what the heck? So I kept making them smaller and smaller. The smaller I made Deuce Vaughn, the better he got in the model, which told me that my model at that point was not very good. I had to go back to the drawing board and see what I could do to rectify this particular outcome. Beefed up the neural network, long story short, from 1,688 neural connections to 14,040. Handled those player inputs coming from the input layer into that first hidden layer with a TAN activation function, which kind of scales it out appropriately. So it kind of deals with some of these outliers a little bit differently. Reran all that stuff. Deuce Vaughn was coming out a little bit more appropriately. As we see now with the 13 and the 17, I still thought that was pretty high considering his size. And then I asked myself, why the heck is this happening? I actually asked that prior to redoing all this stuff. But I asked, why is Deuce Vaughn and A-Chain so good? What is, dragging that value when they go through so high? Why is it liking the smaller players? So I went to go filter my data. So my data is actually any running back in the last 10 seasons who have at least 80 opportunities in that season, or 80 opportunities in a season throughout those 10 years. And then that particular player's best season in terms of fantasy points per game during their entire career. So that's the database. And I went in, I'm like, what's it seeing there on the smaller end players? So sorted my data. And then I looked, anybody that was 196 pounds or less, which is a total of 18 people, there were 42% of those players that achieved at least 14 fantasy points per game at some point in their career. So if the smaller players, 196 pounds or less, got at least 80 opportunities in a season, there's almost a 50-50 chance that these smaller backs produce at least 14 fantasy points per game in a season. And just to give some context around that, that's Delvin Cook last year. He was exactly 14.0 fantasy points per game in a PPR setting. He, I think, was RB15 last year. So that's high-end RB2 numbers from these smaller backs. And that's why the neural network is treating some of these smaller backs the way it is. It's saying, hey, there's a lot of guys down in this range. It's a pretty high hit rate. Some of them kind of bad. such as Jaquiz Rogers. We're looking at Justin Jackson hasn't been very good. LaRod Stevens-Howling is pretty far down there. Dexter McCluster. Daryl Richardson as well, 5.4. But those are the only guys out of the 18 that are 196 pounds or less that actually were less than 10 fantasy points per game. So while the hit rate of these small backs might not be very good in terms of even getting 80 opportunities in a season, as I said, there's only 18 in the last 10 years that weighed 196 pounds or less that got 80 opportunities in a season. But the ones who do seem to produce very well. We got Chris Johnson, kind of really an outlier down there at 191 pounds, 24.56 fantasy point season as his best. He's kind of really raising that up. CJ Spiller, good comp to Gibbs. He's coming in at 15.96 as his best season. And then we got guys like Danny Woodhead at 15.2. We got Philip Lindsay, 14.9. Tariq Cohen, 14.6. Just a lot of guys down there who kind of hit that 14-point threshold. Deion Lewis is in there, 17.2. Like I said, there's a lot of guys down here who hit pretty big, and 14 fantasy points per game. The ones that didn't even hit that are in between, upper 10s, almost 11, and 12, somewhere in that range. So those aren't even bad seasons in general. It seems like these smaller backs who get at least 80 opportunities in a season do very well. And that's why Deuce Vaughn kind of, showed me the light in terms of, A, that my first neural network wasn't performing as it should have. Beefed that up, took care of it. Now it's taking care of my players the way it should in the model. And then secondly, it opened my mind that these smaller backs, while everybody kind of wants to avoid them, if they have 80 opportunities in a season, they seem to perform very well. Not that I think Deuce Vaughn's ever going to get 80 opportunities in a season. I don't think he's necessarily that good, but he was highly productive in college. Should he get those 80 opportunities, he's almost got a 50-50 shot that he's going to get at least 14 fantasy points per game. And then taking that into context with Devon Achane, that's really why he was performing so well. Higher draft capital, that 4.32 speed, very athletic in that sense. It's really liking him. It's not really saying he's going to get 80 opportunities. We know he's going to get a lot of volume in that offense. Almost assuredly, he's going to get 80 opportunities year one here. Who knows after that? But with that in mind, he's almost a lock for that 80 opportunities, which is saying, he's essentially got a 50-50 chance of reaching 14 fantasy points per game. He's worthwhile. He's a top-end RB2 waiting to happen almost essentially. Tons of hits there for these smaller running backs, and that's really what I wanted to get into with this Deuce Vaughn profile is just identifying these smaller backs. Should they get 80 opportunities? Their hit rate is tremendous down there. Almost a 50-50 shot of being a high-end RB2 at some point in their season, at some point during their career, should they get 80 opportunities ever during their career. So that's kind of what I really wanted to highlight in this particular video. Deuce Vaughn coming out super good. Should he get 80 opportunities in a season? We can probably expect him to actually be pretty good. That mean of 13.5, 13.4, not too bad. Really looking at the people that are down there below 196 makes sense why his mean and median are there. And then getting into Deuce Vaughn and Devon Achane, they had really bad M50 gaps. So they had a really large range between their 25th percentile outcome and their 75th. Really what we're seeing some pretty poor people down there at the smaller end. Some really good numbers, but also some really bad numbers. That's going to skew those values further towards those extremes. It's going to go through, train, validate, and it's going to say, hey, based off of this information, they're not going to do so well. And then there's going to be a lot of times where it's saying, hey, based on these values, they're going to do really well, upwards of 18 fantasy points per game for Deuce Vaughn will. And that's why those M50 gaps for those smaller guys, it's highly volatile. It's saying these guys could be really bad or these guys could be really good. In the end, it comes out to a wash somewhere fairly decent because a lot of those guys hit down there. But anyway, that's the Deuce Vaughn profile. That's the explanation. That's maybe an eye-opener for a lot of people in these smaller backs. If we see an opportunity or we see a running back that's smaller in stature that's going to get those 80 opportunities in a season, you can probably think that this person's going to do really well. So hopefully the RStudio model and the machine learning model give everybody a little bit of additional confidence in all of the analysis that we're all doing for each of these incoming rookies. I appreciate the watch, everybody. That's going to do it for today's rookie prospect profile on Deuce Vaughn. Hopefully you learned quite a bit, got some take-home advice that you can use moving forward. I appreciate the view again. This is presented by Zilla Fantasy Elite. Thanks all for tuning in. Have a good one. Bye.
Whole crew on top, really we on top. Wake up every morning with drive. Been on the grind, know I had to survive. We had to win. Started from the dirt and the rubble. I had to be the needle that was popping your bubble.